This is the grids and typesetting lecture for the beginning typography class. And in this lecture, I will cover the basics of grids and how they're used in graphic design, specifically with typesetting. And I'll also go over typesetting basics and rules that you want to follow, ways to be great at setting typography. Grids are a design tool often used to create consistency and coherency in a design. They also allow designers to make decisions more quickly as we work on large multi-page documents. Grids are really about rationality. They really help us determine where things should live on a page. They also allow things to line up and connect that are related. When we work on large projects like magazines or newspapers, it's also very difficult to create those documents on a regular basis. And grids are a great tool that help us do that in a really efficient way. So here's an example of a grid. Here we're looking at a 3-column by 3-row grid. So there's 9 total modules. This is actually something that is worked on in the basic graphic design class. We play with working in a grid structure and working with a visual grid where we're laying out boxes. But I think what's important about this is you can see the variation that can be created from such a simple grid. All of these utilize the grid in the same way, but they're filling the modules in different ways to create a lot of variety. So this one simple structure can create so many different permutations, which is what makes them so advantageous for us in typography and when we're working on multi-page documents. Grids are something that don't belong to graphic designers. They're something that go way back in history. We have always been trying to rationalize and determine how things should look and be. So on the left, we have the Vitruvian Man from Leonardo da Vinci, and that's an example really of looking at human anatomy and identifying how the structure and proportions of our bodies are. On the right is work by Le Corbusier, an architect, where he's really looking at the proportions of the human body and then relating them to form. This was something he sometimes did with his buildings. We also see grids going all the way back to ancient Greece. So when we look at examples of temples from the Greek and the Roman empires, we see that these columns are not arbitrarily placed. They're evenly spaced. They're put on a grid. They line up. And when we start looking at these temple structures, we start seeing a very strict grid system. So there's a rationality and planning of where these columns will go. And that's really similar to what we do with typography or imagery on a page. We really want to make sure that things make sense where they are. And grid structures help us do that in the same way that these grid structures are helping determine these column placement. We've also seen it in other parts of this lecture when we looked at cuneiform. This is a very rudimentary but simple grid. All of these symbols are lined up in rows. If they were just arbitrarily placed all over the page, it would be impossible for this to be read. It would be very difficult to understand what was happening. But this simple grid structure helps us read this. Or in some of the other work we looked at. This is the Gutenberg Bible. It was done on a simple 4-column grid. So there's 2 columns per page, and that structure makes it much easier for us to rationalize it. We also know what all of the pages will look like. It also makes it simpler to do the settings. When you're hand setting, a book that has hundreds of pages, it's going to make it a lot easier if you have a structure down that you can work with. We've also seen grids applied to letter forms. Here's the work of Rue de Roy. When we looked at this, we saw that there was this rationality being placed on how the letter forms were constructed and built, and that came into these grid structures that were placed behind the letter forms that helped determine where shapes would live and how shapes would be formed. So again, a rationality. This is really helping make the decision-making more informed. We also see grid structures in our everyday life. This is a map of New York City. It's based on a very strict grid structure. This makes it a very easy city to navigate. You know that 36th Street is going to come just before 37th. You know that 16th Street will be south of 40th Street. So again, there's just a valuable structure. And by having this grid, it helps make the city easier to navigate. And so in the same way that grids help us navigate cities, grids really help guide the viewer in the context of books and pages. They really help us understand typographic systems and seeing how pages are related to each other. When we're flipping through a magazine, we always know what are the title spreads or the introductory spreads, as opposed to pages that maybe are filled with body copy and story. So that really helps us identify that. And it's visually through the grid and the way the typography is built that helps us navigate these different items. Here's a great example of a grid structure. On the right especially, with this body copy, we see these 4 columns that are laid out on the right-hand side. And even that image fits within that column structure. On the upper right, it fits directly on top of those 2 columns and fits within that column structure. So everything here is fitting within this grid that is really allowing coherency here. The information is rationally placed. It makes sense where it goes. And so it's important that we get in the habit of this. We want to create design that communicates effectively and clearly, and part of that is making sure that there's a rationality for where things are placed and making it as easy for the viewer as possible. Here's some example of Joseph Mueller-Brockman. We can see some of his work. He was one of the pioneers of developing and utilizing the grid. On the left-hand side with all these concentric circular pieces, and they seem arbitrary, but they actually line up, and they line up with each other, and some of them even line up with the typography. Or this Der film on the right, where actually everything is lining up with the left side of that F, creates this wonderful alignment that although the spacing between these things, there's a lot of air and white space that creates a lot of interest and tension, but there's still this alignment on that left-hand side. And he wrote a book called Grid Systems, and it was really one of the first and most important books written about grids, and really was the champion of pushing for gridding and helping create the Swiss style of design that really paramounted using a grid and creating structure within design. We also see the work of Wim Krauwel, who is a Dutch graphic designer who also championed the use of the grid. He even used the grid to create typography. These are 2 examples. On the left, Neue Alphabet, where you're seeing a modular typeface that's built completely on a grid structure. So there's a rationality to how these letters have to be formed, which is what makes them look the way they do. Or the right, the Stedelijk Museum, where he created a grid structure for their identity, and then even built a typeface that fit on top of that grid perfectly. So it actually worked within the grid structure that was created for this piece. So grids really create visual harmony. Grids provide coherency to complexity, and grids really allow you to do more with less. They're a tool. They should help you through this process. They should never limit you. If you're feeling limited by the grid, you maybe need to reevaluate the type of grid that you're using. Because grids can be complex or they can be simple. And it's hard to say, is this a grid? Probably not. Is that a grid? Not really. But is this a grid? Potentially now we're getting somewhere. Maybe this is becoming more of a grid structure. But is this a grid? This is something that we want to avoid because you only need a grid to be as complex as you actually need. And we're not trying to create graph paper. If there's just this many lines all over the page, we're not going to get anywhere because it's going to allow us to place something anywhere. And we may as well not have a grid if we're going to allow ourselves to just arbitrarily place anything on the page. So it's important that you divide the grid and only have as many lines and modules as you really need. So this is a great example of a grid that we will often see in editorial design. It's what we would call a multi-column grid. So you're seeing these columns that are running vertically across the page, and those are really what allow us to determine where things can live. There's also a modular grid, which is where there's horizontal grid lines that come into play, and all of these modules are exactly the same. So there's a uniformity to them, which gives it its power. So when we're looking at grids, each of these have a module or a unit. And that's this interior space that is highlighted. And now we can combine these modules and units together, but each of them as an individual piece is one module or one unit. We also have gutters, and gutters are the spaces that run between the modules. They're really valuable and help determine spacing within a document. Gutters are really going to help ensure that things are spaced evenly. So if you have 4 photos, the gutters are going to help keep them the same distance apart. Or if you have text in a photo, it's going to help make sure that the photo and the text have an even amount of space between them. So it's a consistency thing. It allows us to create consistency throughout the document. You also have the margin, which is the outside of the page. It's an area that we create that helps contain where the artwork and the design work should happen within the page. This doesn't mean that you can't go into the margin, but usually when we do, we bleed. So it'll actually go off the page and completely go off into the margin. Sometimes text is also placed in the margins, things like running copy and page numbers, but for the most part it's an area that we avoid putting content in. So we usually avoid putting photos unless they bleed, or we avoid putting body copy. That is really contained within the central portion of the layout. Then we have columns. Columns are vertical structures that run within the grid. So here we're seeing the combination of these 5 modules to create this column that is 5 modules tall. And we also have rows, which we're seeing here. Rows are horizontal and they run through the grid. So here we're seeing the combination of these 7 modules to create this long horizontal row. So here's some examples of how the grid can be used. It can be used very symmetrically like this. You can combine these modules together in any way that you want, as long as you respect the gutter. If you notice here, we're always keeping the gutter on the outside. You want to combine modules wholly. You want to make sure you try to combine them as much as you can and not divide them. So we wouldn't want one of these blue boxes to not go all the way through the modules. We ideally want to use all of them in their entirety. So here's another example. Here's one where we're bleeding into the margin. So that image on the right is bleeding off into the margin, which is something that we often do, but in this type of way. There's also another concept when we use grids, and that's the concept of stacking. So here you're seeing stacking. These images are different sizes, but they all align on this baseline at the bottom. So there's a grid line that's being used, and then the height of the images is being determined by whatever the height of the image. And you'll notice here that this is one place where we are not using an entire module. So the 2 left images don't complete those modules, but it's okay because they're lining up at the bottom, and at least we're not eating into the gutter. And the opposite concept is hanging. That's where everything is aligned at the top, and how far down the images go is determined on the image size. So here's the exact concept just shown in reverse. So again, these grids really help us. A newspaper comes out every single day. If you had to redesign a newspaper every day, it would make your job impossible. There's a high likelihood that the newspaper would not always come out, or the number of hours and labor that would be used to redesign it every day maybe wouldn't even make it cost effective. So there's a strict grid here, and you can see that on this cover. You can see the column structures that are built, and the way they're using graphic elements and lines to divide these things up, and the way that all of the images also fit within the grid. It creates coherency. It makes it really easy for us to find information and see these different stories. Grids also help activate white space. That's another thing that they do, is sometimes by not placing things in certain places on the grid, it actually creates interest. So here's an example of a poster where we can see the grid and how all of the type in the middle perfectly fits within that grid. But then we can also look at the white space that's created by the interesting placement, and how that's what really makes this poster interesting, is the way that there's not information in certain areas that activates and creates this interesting white. We also see grids on the web. Grids are really important when we create websites because it helps us develop them. It helps us create structure in the same way that we do with page layout in print. So it's really important that when you think about grids, they're also something that you'll use digitally, because they're really going to rationalize where information lives. They're really going to help us see what information is related, and also create a general structure that's going to create coherency for all the information the viewer is taking in. So guidelines are simplified grids that are often used for projects that are not as complex or do not require multiples or variations. So sometimes when you're working, there's no need to create an entire grid structure. Maybe it's a poster that you're working on and there's just not that much typography. You may not create an actual grid, you'll use guidelines, but you still want to have things that line up. You want to have a rationality for where these things should be. So the DER film is another great example. We looked at this before, but here I'm actually highlighting that line, and you can see how this one single guideline is determining the placement of a lot of this content. So sometimes this will be helpful too, is just having some lines and some determinations of how things are placed or where things should live. Sometimes designers will intuitively start laying things out on a page, and then they'll go back and kind of clean up and line things up and make rational decisions based on the instincts that they initially made. They'll kind of go through that refinement process. So that may be something that you want to explore as well. Great grids are versatile, and they'll allow for many solutions while still creating strong unity. Because that's what this is really about. It's creating that unified structure. And when used correctly, they should really aid in your design process. They shouldn't stifle you. Like I said, a grid should work for you. It should be a tool that helps you execute whatever you're working on. So typesetting is a very important skill to have as a designer. It allows you to make text more readable and fix typographic errors that are often problematic in longer settings of text. I think it is just a very good habit to get into. It's very good to understand this skill because it's very important to graphic designers. I also feel that it's a skill that is eroding. I think it's important to understand these things because many people don't. And I think it shows that you really care about your work. So here's some examples of typesetting that maybe is not ideal. Here we're really looking at line length. So when we're looking at setting copy, we want to have the length of text be something that is easily readable. So if you're looking at the top, that line length is very long, and it's hard for your eyes to track and follow that content all the way across. Although this content isn't readable, it doesn't actually make sense in English. It's lorem ipsum, which is a placement text that we use in graphic design. It still is challenging to track that far. And same on the bottom left. Tracking too short can be difficult too. When there's too many line breaks and jumps where your eyes tracking back and forth again and again, that can also be very tiring and difficult to read. But when we're looking at an optimal setting like the ones that are here, it also depends on the type itself. So one line length for one type setting might not work for another, and that's really going to be determined by how large the type is, whether it's condensed or extended, and also just the style of the typeface. So here are some that have been fixed. These are all more optimal settings, and you'll notice that like bottom left, because this is an extended typeface, I can set it in a longer setting because our eyes can track further. Or on the bottom right, that's a condensed typeface, and I need to set it in a smaller column width because more characters can fit in that space. And that's really what this is about. You want to really go after between 45 and 75 characters per line, or about 60 characters with spacing is appropriate. There's some wiggle room here, but this is something you just want to look at. And when you're setting paragraphs, make sure that you're looking at how many characters are there per line because it will help create something that's more easily readable. When you're doing shorter columns, things like magazines and newspapers, you can go a little bit smaller, 35, 55 characters. But again, that's going to help because the number of characters is really a good rule to go by because it's not really being determined by the typeface itself, because extended typefaces are going to fit fewer characters per line. So again, you can have a longer line length. So characters is really the ideal way to go when we're looking at line length. We want to avoid what are called widows and orphans. So those are words that are by themselves, like in that first paragraph, laureate, or in the last paragraph on the bottom right, the cubist. Those are things we want to avoid. There should not be there. This is a typographical error that you need to fix. So if you see things like that, it's important that you create line breaks or play with the tracking ever so slightly to try to remove these things. Also at the upper right, the sit emet estoret, that is something that shouldn't be there either. You never want one line of text from a paragraph to come up to the other side. It's something we always want to avoid as much as possible. Although this one's 3 words, it's still not ideal. If it was 1 word, it would be a definite no. But again, these are things that you need to fix, things that you need to look for as you're setting copy. Sometimes I like to think that you're a little bit of a detective. As you're setting this text, you also need to be going back and trying to find these errors. As we talked about in a previous lecture, there are 3 different alignment settings that we can select. There's the left align, which we're looking on the left, the centered in the middle, and the right aligned on the right. And these are all going to change the way that the text is read. For the most part, you're going to want to set text left align. It is going to be the easiest for us to read. Centered is a little bit more challenging, but definitely not as challenging as right aligned. You want to use that as sparingly as possible, and mostly for large text. When you're setting body copy or large spans of text, you'll mostly want to focus on left aligned copy. Then we have the justified settings, which we also looked at. On the left with the justified with the left align at the bottom, the middle with the justified centered alignment at the bottom, and then the full justification on the right. So that's where the words and letters are split apart so that they align on both the left and right hand sides. When we set text in a justified setting, which is what we're looking at, that's where the type completely squares off on both sides, so there's no rag. It will often create rivers, which are these white spaces that are running between these words. It's very distracting. It makes it very hard for the viewer to read. So if you do take on the challenge of doing justified typesetting, it's important that you spend time to fix these things by creating line breaks, adjusting tracking. Sometimes even adjusting the text itself becomes necessary. Obviously, this is not allowed on some of these assignments, But when you're working in the real world, oftentimes there's slight adjustments made that help this justified copy set more beautifully. Here's an example of it where I've adjusted the tracking, I've adjusted things slightly to allow the rivers to disappear. There might be a little bit of spacing in some places. It's much more readable. It's much easier for the viewer to get through. The other thing we can look at here is paragraph indicators. As we create paragraphs in long settings of text, there's different ways that we can indicate these paragraphs. These really help the viewer understand how the information chunks together and the different thoughts and ideas that are contained within the text. So we have an indent on the left, a fairly typical paragraph indicator that we see. It's very successful. Although it's something that's common, it doesn't mean it's not a great solution. In the middle is a line break, so we can also create more space between the paragraphs by either using a return or increasing the leading there so that we get this spacing between the paragraphs. Then on the right, we have a very unusual solution, which is the exdent. That's where the first lines actually come left of the margin of the text. So it's the opposite of an indent. It's actually an exdent. So something that you don't see very often. It's sometimes difficult to make work, but we are seeing it here with a line break as well. So there's a line break and an exdent happening. Then sometimes we see things like this. We'll look at this in the graphic elements lecture, but where lines or different ornaments are actually used to denote the paragraph break. So that's sometimes something that we see as well. But paragraph indicators can be something that are very important for the reader, and they need to be handled in the right way. And these are some of the different solutions that you can take to create different paragraph indicators. You want to hang punctuation. This is another important thing, especially when you're dealing with quotes or bulleted lists. We want the quotation mark in the upper left to actually come outside of the margin. Or when we're working with a list, this last flavor of ice cream, sea salt caramel, because there is not a hanging of that bullet, it makes the viewer not sure if it's sea salt caramel, cookie swirl, coffee triple crunch? Or did someone forget a bullet for cookie swirl, coffee triple crunch? But if we hang that bullet, we suddenly see that that is actually all one flavor. The entire thing goes together. And again, we'll see that quote in the upper left that comes out of that margin. So these are really important things to do. These are good typographic habits to get into. Hanging punctuation. So this mostly applies to bullets and quotation marks, but occasionally other items as well. There's also different kinds of symbols that we need to evaluate. And here there are 3 different horizontal strokes, but they're all different. The one on the very left is a hyphen. It is the shortest of the 3. In the middle, we have the N dash, that's EN dash. It is the middle in length. And then on the very right, the longest of these symbols is the M dash, EM dash. So these are all different symbols, although they're very similar, and they're all very important and used for different things. It's important to remember why these are used, and this is where a little bit of grammar can sometimes come into design. But because we are working with text and we are typesetting, it's important that we respect and understand that. So hyphens are really used when we're setting copy for hyphenated words. So things like in depth, that is a hyphenated word. It needs a hyphen in it, so it should have a hyphen. We also see hyphens when we're setting text and a word is not completed. So if a word is not finished on that line and goes to the next line, we will see a hyphen inserted there to let us know that that word continues. That's another place that we use a hyphen. You will also use a hyphen in a hyphenated name. So someone like Catherine Zeta Jones. Her name is hyphenated, Zeta and Jones. So you need a hyphen between those 2 last names. Then we get to the N dash. The N dash is used mostly when we're talking about a range. So 100 to 200 pages. That is a range that is being noted. And when we have a range of dates or things or numbers, we use an N dash with no space on either side. So here the example is 100 N dash 200 pages, which reads as 100 to 200 pages. Then we also have the M dash. That is primarily used when there's a change of thought within a sentence. So there's a change of thought, but there's not a period because these thoughts are related, but that adjustment of thought needs a grammatical notation for the viewer to know that there's a shift in thinking. So here I have beware it is. So there's an M dash placed in between there with no spaces. Now this is where things can get a little confusing because you can actually also do that with an N dash. but it needs to have a space on either side. So if there's also a shift in thinking, shift in thought, you can also use an N dash, the smaller one, but you need to have a space on either side of it, where the M dash should not have any spaces. Another place that these marks appear is in quote attributions. So where we're attributing who said a quote. So here I have Michael Jordan. We're using an M dash here, the longest of the marks, and there's no space between the M and the M dash. So you'll see that it's just no space, they're right up against each other. But it is also acceptable to use an N dash, the shorter mark, but it has to have a space after it. So one thing I like to remind myself is, for the most part, if I'm going to use an N dash, it needs to have spaces around it unless it's a range, where M dashes should never have spaces and hyphens should never have spaces. So that's a good rule of thumb potentially to help you remember how these things are used, but it's good to nail these things down so you understand them. We also want to avoid hyphenation. So I talked about this. This is one of the places that a hyphen can be used. Here I've purposefully created some hyphenation, and we have 5 in a row. It's very obnoxious. It's really hard for the viewer to track and read this copy with so many hyphenations. You don't want to avoid having them altogether because sometimes they're necessary. Sometimes it's more appropriate to have one, potentially, if it's going to make the copy set in a better way. But I would say if you can avoid them altogether, that's ideal. But again, maybe 1 or 2 for every 5 to 6 lines of copy would be appropriate. You want to avoid ever having more than 1 in a row. That's something that you would definitely want to go in and fix. Then there's a more technical aspect of typesetting that happens inside of the computer, and that's understanding a little bit of what optical and metrics are. So you'll see in the character palette on the left here that this is set at optical. And for the most part, that's going to be incorrect. You are always going to want to have this set on metrics. Because what's happening here is the type designer builds in the spacing and determines the spacing of that typeface when they design it. And that is being used in the metrics setting. What's happening in optical is it's something inside of the computer that's determining the spacing on its own. It's more of a computer algorithm inside of InDesign that's making those spacing decisions. So it's actually removing and destroying the spacing considerations that were actually intended by the designer themselves. You may only want to use optical if for some reason you are working with a poorly spaced typeface, or a typeface that isn't of high quality, and you want some help from the computer in terms of getting some general spacing before you go back and kern things. But if you're working with high quality typefaces, you should never be using the optical setting. It should always be set to metrics. That's really where you're keeping the integrity of the design of the typeface and the spacing that was intended by that designer. So these are good typographic habits to get into, and train your eyes to spot these errors. It's part of your job as you're typesetting and going through copy is to find these things and fix them. They are errors and they are on you to fix. So make sure that you find these things and pay attention to them. Because having good typesetting skills is important, and it really shows that you're a true professional and you care about the craft. That it's not just about getting copy on the page. You're also really looking at how can you craft the copy to make it the most readable and to set it in the most beautiful way that really showcases your understanding of typography.